everybody. Welcome back to our sister chat. We are here. I'm Kendra Fitzgerald. This is my sister, Nicole Coons.
Hello.
And this week we're talking about 7 ways to minimize tearing during childbirth. And make sure you stick around to the very end because we're going to share some exercise with you that you can do to prepare yourself for actual childbirth to minimize that tearing risk.
If you're planning to have an epidural for your delivery, the epidural means you can't feel what's going on in your pelvic floor. And when you can't feel what's going on, it can be harder to feel connected to what you're doing. And if you're creating tearing or not, you just don't have any idea. So I really encourage you to listen to this full video because at the very end, we're going to talk about these exercises and the strategies that you can use. Even if you can't feel your pelvic floor, you're still going to want to use these strategies and then strategies for recovering right after vaginal delivery that can help to restore some of that pelvic floor resilience. Another reason you may want to really make sure you tune into this, those of you who are really active have really strong and tight pelvic floors, which is fantastic because you need that core integration with your core and pelvic floor. However, during pregnancy and for birth, we want that pelvic floor to be able to expand and to come back.
And studies have shown that endurance athletes and runners in particular have a higher instance of assisted vaginal delivery, meaning that their pelvic floors were so tight that they actually had to have some help getting the baby out. So the strategies that we're going to talk about at the end, the exercises, are particularly important for you athletes out there. I'm really glad that we're talking about this because tearing is something that not many people talk about, or they're embarrassed to talk about in childbirth.
Or they're afraid to talk about it because it's like, oh, if I don't talk about it, then it probably just won't happen.
Plus, if you have tearing, it makes your recovery a lot longer. So the less you can tear and the more flexible your pelvic floor muscles are and your perineum is during pregnancy, your recovery will be a lot better too.
Yeah, so, on that note, a lot of advice out there, I think, is really like you need a strong pelvic floor. Well, what does that really mean? You need a strong pelvic floor. Really what you don't need a strong meaning like stiff and tight pelvic floor. What it means is you need a resilient pelvic floor, one that can expand and then come back, right? We want one that has a lot of resilience in it. So what's the proper training for resilience in your pelvic floor? And that's one of the things we're going to talk about today. We think of the pelvis as the place where obviously we deliver baby through the pelvis, and we think of the bones of the pelvis, but we don't think about the other half, the muscles, and unless we have a tear. And there's actually a lot we can talk about with respect to all of the pelvis and the muscles and the bones that are going to help you prepare for having a vaginal delivery with reduced or no tearing.
Number 1 is know the anatomy. The pelvic floor is, it's the base of your pelvis and it runs from the pubic bone to the tailbone and then out to the sit bones. And we recently saw a really cool image of exactly what the pelvic floor muscles do when you're giving birth. They move along with the baby. And so it's kind of like this image of the muscles going in and out and stretching out to make room for the baby and to elongate as the baby's coming out. And I know sometimes we get the idea that it's just this opening that opens and closes, but that's not actually the case.
Yeah, this is really good. And I'll tell you, we talk about this in the birth club in the Mother's Practice for Birth segment. And we get really detailed with pictures and models, and we really look at the muscles of the pelvic floor. So knowing the anatomy and knowing like what the muscles are, there's many layers of muscles in your pelvic floor, and they move in different directions. And not surprisingly, the direction that they move actually facilitates passage of a baby's head and a baby's body out of the vaginal opening with a great deal of ease. So know the anatomy so that there is no mystery. And a lot of times any tearing that happens is a function of tension created by fear about what's happening down there, right? So if we know what our anatomy is and we are comfortable and we understand the anatomy, we understand how the anatomy is working, how the muscles are working, then the chances of creating tension based on lack of knowledge is eradicated. And that kind of takes us into our number 2 way.
The second way to minimize tearing during a vaginal birth is to use that anatomy knowledge to your advantage and visualize.
That's right. So what this one really means is we know that when you start to look at the anatomy, you understand that the opening for where baby comes through, the vaginal opening, is more towards the front of the total pelvis, towards the pubic bone, not towards the back or even in the middle. And so when you're birthing your baby, when you're pushing, we're not having an image of pushing baby straight down. It's actually more of like a J shape, right? It's like a forward and out. And having that visual image of where you're pushing, where are you applying your focus and your pressure, that is going to minimize tearing because you're sending energy in the right direction. And so using that visual to your advantage is the second way to reduce or prevent tearing during vaginal birth.
A third way to minimize tearing during a vaginal birth is all about positioning. I think this is a super important one because your position is everything.
Yes. So position has to do with actually the pelvis itself, right? So position has to do with, are you on your back? Are you standing? Are you squatting? Are you leaning forward? There are definitely positions that are optimal for getting baby down and out, which is again, that J direction, than others. You can imagine lying on your back is potentially the most difficult way to help move baby down and out without tearing. So positioning your body in a position that supports that J shape descent. So more likely your pelvis is going to be tipped forward or on an angle. So instead of lying on your back, maybe lie on your side. If you have an epidural and you can't be up and about, then lie on your side so that you can get that forward tilt and help baby move in that forward J direction. If you're standing or if you're squatting, same thing. The pelvis is naturally tipped more forward, helping baby move towards the front of the opening at the base.
The fourth way to minimize tearing during vaginal birth is to use pushing strategies. And being really strategic about the way you push can mean the difference between no tearing or a 4th degree tear, which goes really far down. And in that time, when you're about to push, it feels like you just want to get it over with and you're like, get it out. But that is definitely the time to like take it slow down. The slower you go, the better, because those muscles will have a better opportunity to spread and stretch. And muscles don't stretch really quickly, really fast. And if you push them too hard, then they will tear because they have to go somewhere.
The second is don't bear down. One way to kind of become aware of this or practice this when you are pregnant is to blow through a straw. Blowing through a straw is a great way to practice. When you blow through a constricted hole, you see what happens in your pelvic floor. Do you push down? So bearing down would be actually pushing the pelvic floor out. And that's what we want to avoid, because that obviously just puts more pressure on the pelvic floor in addition to the baby descending onto the pelvic floor and through. We don't want to bear down. We don't want to push the pelvic floor out. Instead, what we do is use good breathing.
The other place you can practice is when you're going to the bathroom. When you are going poop, you can practice this, because it's the same ejection reflex. It's called the fetal ejection reflex, which if you wait when you're pushing, you wait, if somebody's screaming at you, gotta push now, and you don't feel like pushing, you don't have to push. And you will know when it's time to push because it will feel like you have to go to the bathroom. And the best technique is to breathe out, just like Nicole talked about with the straw, when you are going. And you can practice that when you're going to the bathroom, and you'll notice if you sit with a squatty potty and you wait, the ejection reflex will happen using that breath, and things will move a lot smoother. Especially during pregnancy when there's so much, so many issues with constipation and we try to get things moving. It's a great way to practice.
That leads us right into the fifth way to minimize tearing during a vaginal birth, and that is breathing versus holding your breath. And breathing has so many benefits because, again, we talked earlier about tension, right? Tension in the pelvic floor creates resistance, and resistance, if you've got a lot of pressure, it's got to go somewhere, and we don't want it to go into a tear. We want it to go through, right, through the muscles to actually slowly, gradually elongate. And breathing not only will help to slow down and give that energy somewhere else to go, breathing also calms the nervous system down. So if you're holding your breath, you're tending to get a little more excited, a little more intense. Breathing and not holding your breath as best you can when you're pushing is really going to help you minimize tearing during your vaginal birth.
The sixth way to minimize tearing during childbirth is to practice perineal massage before your birthday. Your doctor or midwife might have talked to you about this, or your doula perhaps already, but it's basically taking your thumb, putting some oil on it and rubbing your fingers along the opening of your vagina so that you can spread the muscles a bit and they get used to that movement of opening. And so then when you go to do this movement, as your baby is coming down, those muscles are already ready to open and elongate as much as you need.
Yeah. You can also ask your doctor or midwife if they have a practice of supporting you in labor during the pushing and delivery phase, of providing either a perineal massage or any kind of support for your perineum, your vaginal opening, when baby is crowning and as you're pushing baby through. Some doctors are very proactive, and it's a great conversation to have with your doctor to find out what their common practices are and how they can support you.
I just want to add in here that you've probably heard of the ring of fire, and this is what we're talking about. It's that point when the baby's head is stretching your perineum very far and it burns. And I'm not gonna lie to you, it hurts. You know, it's pretty intense and it does feel like burning and fire. But if you can stay with it and just know that when you feel that burning, that's the time to slow down. Don't try to muscle through it. This is not the time to muscle through it. I actually made that mistake because I was like, get this baby out. And then, it just pushed too hard. But when you feel that ring of fire, it does exist. It's a real thing. That's the time to slow down.
So that's really interesting because for me, I never experienced the ring of fire.
Really?
Matter of fact, yeah, I really didn't. So my first one, I can't say for sure because I had an epidural with my first. My second one, I had no medication. One of my teachers had planted this idea in my mind and it stuck. And what she said is some women experience the descent and the arrival of baby at the pelvic floor, like where normally we would describe it as the ring of fire, but they experience that as very satisfying. It's a shift in focus from the contractions of the uterus and the body sensations that you're having down to a point where you can visualize, you can feel the baby. And it's just like, it's a very satisfying experience for some people. And she just planted that word that this is satisfying. And I think for me, it was more of that experience than any kind of pain or fire. That definitely was not a word that occurred to me or that I felt. So, or be aware of the words that you're choosing to describe, even the word tearing, like that sounds kind of intense, and it is intense if it happens, but elongating the muscles, making room, satisfaction, like that feeling of like, okay, Kendra talked about, when you're pooping, kind of that feeling. It's like that let go feeling, that is before we get to the place of pain, right? If you think about, if you're like constipated and you're trying, or like your kid, I'm sure we all have memories of like when we were kids and we didn't have good, bathroom habits. We would like hold it for a long time and you'd have to go to the bathroom and it would hurt. It would be hard. But if you keep it kind of like relaxed and just let it go when it goes, then there's no pain. There's no fire sensations. It's a wide range of experiences, and one way, and an additional way you can relate to this sensation of baby crowning is that it could be very satisfying.
And I think it goes to the point that everybody feels everything differently.
Yeah.
And, and knowing your own desires and wishes and what you want from your birth, you can take both of our stories, listen, and then let them go and decide what you take and what you leave. And you won't be swayed by other people's stories, right? If you're really steadfast in your decisions and what is true for you, it will make it easier for you to choose which stories to listen to, right? Yeah. But also, I think there's a really thin line between pain and pleasure.
Yes. Yeah.
People have different definitions for both of those. And so I think with birth, both exist and they can exist simultaneously. And it's kind of, I think that it's kind of an interesting place. It can be kind of confusing because like, is this pain or is it pleasure?
Yeah, it's the same receptors in your brain. So it's kind of up to you.
Yeah. Perineal massage.
There's another one. I'll tell you, like perineal massage is one of the most uncomfortable things you will do, but it does.
Not fun.
No, it is very uncomfortable and not fun. However, if you can do it, even 2 or 3 times, even 1 time, it's a good thing to do because it's sort of like warming up your muscles a little bit. Like, hey, muscles, we're going to do something kind of intense soon. So let's get into the zone.
All right, this brings us to the 7th way to minimize tearing during a vaginal birth. And the 7th one is exercises that you can do to prepare. Really specifically, these are actually exercises that I give to moms who are really like in their 36th week and beyond, because birth is pretty imminent. And we want to start opening the pelvic floor and letting the pelvis release and soften, which goes along with letting those muscles know that it's okay to lengthen, because up to this point, we've kind of like tried to keep the baby in and keeping the pelvic floor, kind of lifted. And then once you get ready for birth, then you can start softening out. The exercises that I love to give to 3rd trimester, about ready to give birth moms, are focused on eccentric load. So eccentric loading is the movement of releasing out of a contraction. So if you think of a bicep curl, this is a concentric move of lifting your arm up, even unweighted, right? You're lifting against gravity. But the eccentric is when you lower your arm, but you keep some resistance here and you're working against gravity. So you're not just letting it drop. There's actually more benefit in using this eccentric contraction because you're working against gravity than just doing the upward motion, which also applies to the pelvic floor because we talk about all the time about releasing the pelvic floor as much as you engage. And the eccentric contraction in terms of the pelvic floor is when you're practicing those squats, it's that concentric contraction when you lift up, when you're lifting and drawing up into the Kegel position. And then the eccentric is softening and letting go of your pelvic floor, not just totally letting it flop out, but letting it go as you go back into that squat. I know this might sound kind of hard to fathom in your head, but try it. You can sit on the edge of a chair, squat up and down, and just see what happens if you can slowly release that pelvic floor out. If you want to do it with no movement, you can do that too. That can be just as challenging because sometimes, we've got that nice, slow, steady lift, and then we go to release and it's like, done.
Yeah.
The other exercise that you can do is a wide squat with a side-to-side rock. And I give this to all of my clients because not only does it prep your pelvic floor and start opening your pelvic floor, but it preps you for the marathon of labor that is coming. And it preps your muscles to have the endurance and the strength to really open and, let your glutes and let your hamstrings and your quads do the work of supporting your hips so your pelvis can soften. That wraps up the 7 ways to minimize tearing during a vaginal birth. Thank you so much for joining us. We'd love to know from you, what are you struggling most with in terms of childbirth and prepping for childbirth? Let us know down in the comments below, and we'll answer your questions in future videos.
If you love this discussion and you want to actually put some of these tips into practice, you can join us inside the Birth Club, and in particular, check out the modules on Mother's Practice for Birth because we get really detailed with a lot of this information so you can put it to practice and have a great experience.
You know what I love about these sister chats is that, who better to talk to than your sister?
Oh, I know.
Anything to your sister. There's no such thing as too much information. It's just awesome.
Mm-hmm.